Welcome to the Product Design Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Coelen, founder of UX Cabin, where we create world-class web and mobile apps. I'm excited to bring you a behind-the-scenes look into the lives of some of the most interesting and talented people in product design. We'll get strategic advice on how they got to where they are today and things they wish they would have known earlier in their career. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us on this episode of the Product Design Podcast. We have an exciting guest to talk to and hear some of her experience. Today we have with us Jadene Aderonmu. She is a senior product designer from a digital consultancy called Methods. Thank you so much for coming on with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to speak with you today.
Yeah, why don't you give us a little bit of insight into your life, who you are, where you live, what you like to do, and then we'll kind of dive into your career path.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, my name's Jadene. I'm a senior UX designer based in the UK. I am involved with the research and user experience part in my role, which I like to do day to day, away from the screen. I really like to get out in nature, go on hikes, walking, all the good stuff. And then inside design, I am a mentor and YouTuber outside of my day-to-day job.
Awesome. Well, everyone in the UX design or product design space always has a really interesting career path. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got started in your career and what led you to design and research and UX?
Yeah, absolutely. So way back when, I always wanted to be a fine artist initially in just my day-to-day life. At college, however, that kind of changed because I wanted to go off and go to art school and maybe move to France even and just get into painting. But then I discovered graphic design, which I really liked because you were given a brief, and from that brief, you used design creatively to produce solutions, whether that be for marketing, branding, all those other kind of things. So I went on to university and did a degree in graphic design, which was good. And at the time when I was at university, you could see that there was a bigger push on things that were going on the web, whether that be products, online services, websites and apps. And I could see earlier on that there was more happening in that space than compared to traditional printing and branding methods. So after university, I got my first role as a digital designer, and that was kind of quite a well-rounded role in the design space. And there were still touch points on doing things like marketing materials and designing logos or event branding, which was quite nice. And I still like to flex that graphic design muscle, but I also quite enjoyed the web design aspect of things and designing the interface for apps. So at that role, I was there for 4 years in the digital agency. And that's where I really got a good grounding of web design and designing interfaces for apps. And then wanted to move on to a more senior role. And I applied for a web design role at a different agency. And it was a really long hiring process because they were still trying to work out on their end what they needed from that role. And partway through, so I kind of accidentally got into UX because the requirements of the role changed, and they decided instead of a web designer, they needed a user experience designer. And because I'd gone so far down the process, interviews, challenges, they kind of let me have the first shot at it almost by saying, like, we understand that you've gone through this whole recruitment process and we're really sorry, but we realize now that we need a UX designer. And I was like, oh my gosh, what's a UX designer? Of course, saying it in my head. Would you like to apply for the role? Did some quick research and discovered, oh my gosh, this is amazing. You're advocating for the user and you're so much closer than you would be in previous roles, but there's a bit of a gatekeeper. You're not quite as close to the stakeholders, the users. And I thought, I'll take the job. I'll be a UX designer. And a lot of that was kind of learning quite quickly in the role itself, which it was kind of like a restart. It's kind of going back to uni days and learning a lot. But because it was really exciting. I just felt like I'd found gold with this job because it really brought a lot of things that I wanted to do to the table. I ran with it and grew quite quickly in the UX design space.
Wow, that's amazing. So, did you find it difficult to transition from traditional graphic design to more web based user experience design? Or was it something that was just so interesting to you that it didn't even feel like work to try to learn more and get better at it?
I think it was definitely more of the second one because when I was in my early digital design role, I really wanted to be the person who was presenting those designs and speaking to the people who'd be using them. But that was kind of not heard of in that particular space as a digital designer because you'd create the work and then the project manager would then present your work to the stakeholder who would then do some sort of user testing. It was a really staggered process and I felt very far away from the users and the research and the insights. So it was just really exciting to be like firsthand doing user research and testing and learning from some really brilliant and patient UX designers. Because when you're new, you've got loads of questions and don't know everything, which is fine.
That's awesome. That's really cool. Yeah, I think the whole like revolution of UX as a core competency skill or role is so fascinating because I think the thought process in years past was like, if the user's not smart enough to figure it out, they're just not smart, right? And that's so bad for business and so bad just for empathy and just human outlook. So I'm really thankful for the establishment of UX and product design as something that is really championed at the business level and people see as important. So you are a senior UX designer at this digital consultancy. Can you tell us a little bit about what your day to day is and what you find yourself doing a lot of the time?
So where I am now is my second role in UX. And in my first role, I was involved in both the research and the UX design. Where I am now, the team structure is a lot different. So I can focus solely on the UX design and perhaps support the user researchers. We have an agile team, which means that we work in 2-week sprints. And our team is made up of user researchers, content designers, service designers, two of which, like, it's my first time working with these types of designers, which is really exciting to collaborate with them. And they just narrow down and focus on really specific areas of the design process, which really helps me to then go ahead and focus on the UX of things. Also working alongside business analysts, product owners, and the front and back end developers. So we've got a really multidisciplinary team who are all so knowledgeable and fantastic to work alongside. And a typical day will always start with stand up, 9:45. We all log into Teams and discuss what we did yesterday and then what we're going to be doing today. So if we identify any blockers, we can come together and just kind of help unpack those and see how we can support each other to move the project forward during the sprint. Let's say I might have signed up to observe some user research, and that would involve me sitting in on a session and taking notes for the user researcher, and then also asking any design specific questions throughout. Prior to that session, I might have put together a prototype that they would run through. And what's quite unique to my role and not very common with most designers is that it does require a little bit of coding. So that great big debate that you see on social media of like, do designers need to code? My reply is always, it depends. I can never say like a solid hard no, because sometimes we need to know a little bit of code and other times we don't.
That's great. Yeah, there's a bunch I want to dive in and unpack there. You brought up a few different design roles. I think you said UX designer, UX researcher, and then service designer. Can you give a little blurb of description of what like each of those roles are responsible for?
Yeah, I will try my best, particularly with service design, because it's my first time working with a service designer. So trying to condense their role is challenging for me, but I will give it a go. So a content designer, they really focus on making things easier for people to understand and use. So they're not to be mistaken for copywriters. Their role is involves a lot more than that. So they can be involved in working on a single piece of content or the end-to-end journey of the service to help users create their goal and deliver policy intent. So they really double down on the language and how the content will add to the user experience, which is really helpful because that then frees up UX designers from focusing and doubling down on that area of the service or the product journey. When we move over to service designers, they design the end-to-end journey of the service. So we always say that they take a step back and look at how a user will use a particular project in like the whole grand scheme of things. So they look at the activities that they do before and after. They'll also, in their role, be involved with looking at what a user would do, both in the digital and offline space. And I think these two particular roles are quite key because I work within like the UK government sector within education, and we find that these particular designer roles are really good at supporting and integrating new services into the existing huge body of work that goes on within education, because there are a lot of existing services that have been digitized and moved online, and we really need to ensure that we make those user journeys as seamless as possible.
Very cool. It sounds like you've transitioned a little bit from doing research to more so solely focusing on just the UX design piece. What kind of went into your thought process in that transition, and what do you like about UX design that you want to be able to spend more of your time doing that versus research?
I think it's mainly what came with my new role. So I had to kind of balance up the pros and cons of what taking this next step into where I am now would be. So prior to that, as we touched on, I did do both the research and the UX design, but in this new role, with it solely being UX, that allowed me to then take on and oversee the accessibility community at Methods. So when I joined, I'd come from a company that accessibility was their bread and butter because they were working with local councils who had to ensure that their services adhered to accessibility best practices by law, because we recently had some legislation come in place in the UK towards the end of 2020 that meant that anyone in the public sector had to ensure that their websites and services were accessible. And then this year, mobile applications in the public sector have to follow the same laws and regulations. So coming from that space and moving into a new space where that wasn't as established, I saw an opportunity to work with colleagues, heads of departments to get those conversations about accessibility going and conduct surveys, find out where the company stood at whole. And they really supported me in that area to make sure that this is something important, that this is something that all of our colleagues are equipped to advocate for when they go out and work on their projects. So it's still very much a work in progress, but I feel like really supported and able to expand and run with it and build something here, which is really exciting.
That's fantastic. So you brought up something that I don't think we've talked about on the podcast yet, which is web accessibility. Could you give a little short definition of what web accessibility is and why it's important for us as product designers and UX designers to know about?
Yeah, absolutely. So web accessibility is the process of removing barriers to make sure that services, tools, and websites are accessible to everyone, that they don't have to add any additional steps to then access those services, or that they're not excluded. The reason why accessibility is important, I think this is something that I experienced when I joined my first UX role, is that once you understand that by making simple changes to your design, your processes, your way of working, you can allow your product and service to be used by everyone. I think for me, it just made sense of like, that's the right thing to do, that everyone should be able to have access to online services. especially in the age that we are now, where quite a lot of things that we do are online. It's important as designers and people in tech to allow everyone to use their services and what they create.
Yeah.
It also gives you a much wider reach too. Like, you have a bigger audience and you reach more people, and it's inclusive as well.
Awesome. So obviously, web accessibility is about helping people who have disabilities to be able to access websites and content and apps. What are some of the tangible ways that you make something non-accessible accessible, or what are strategies to make your design accessible from the start that you can intentionally build into your products?
I think if you were coming with zero experience of web accessibility, it'd be great if you could just do like an intro course or something that will set that foundation there for you, because then you will be equipped to build your own quick fire checklist, which is not necessarily everything you can possibly do to make something accessible, because I think it's about building a process. But simple things that you could do is, like, if you come to a website, just try using the tab key to tab through a website and use keyboard navigation only to see if you can access different pages, fill in a form, those different things. Those are some of the tests that I'd run. Then you can also get different Chrome extensions like Wave or Site Improve, which run lots of automated tests for you quickly on a website and then pull up any errors that they would find. However, I've got to caveat that not everything that I've raised by these tools are 100% accurate. Like, some of them might be false positives, and it does require like the human eye to go through and just double check that, oh, actually this isn't an issue because X, Y, and Z. But the benefit of using tools like this is that they give you a definition of why this is an issue, and also often give you a solution of, if you do these things, this is how you could fix it and resolve it. And I think using those tools and then using manual testing methods will help you improve the accessibility of your website and your service.
Yeah, that's great. So in your history of working with web accessibility, what do you think is like the most common fault of sites that aren't accessible? Would it be contrast or keyboard navigation, or what would you say is the number one fault that you find in current websites and apps?
I think that's a really hard one, because I don't think I've seen a pattern of, this is always an issue. I know that designers often talk about color contrast, because initially that's the first thing we understand or may know about accessibility. Like, if the contrast isn't correct, that people would struggle to read, for, let's say, text on an image or like the text on a normal background. But like, one that I have seen that perhaps comes by people not being aware of accessibility or having that consideration. One that I found recently was quite subtle. It's if you have like a website and it auto plays a video when you arrive, what you're meant to do is have a way to pause that video on the site. But oftentimes I didn't think that's a consideration in the process. Because some designers think, oh, we just want it to autoplay, it'll look great. But some users would struggle with that. Let's say if you've got photo sensitive epilepsy, perhaps, or something that'd be triggered by a moving image, or perhaps you just don't want to see a video. Having that option to pause and interact and adjust the site for your best usage is a good thing to have in place.
A few minutes ago, you kind of mentioned your current role requires you to do a little bit of coding, and I've recently done a web accessibility project at my company, and it was really, really helpful to have a knowledge of some front end concepts, because so much in accessibility has to do with making HTML markup in a format that's readable to screen readers, like associating your labels with your inputs, or using the right tags to identify what is the main content area or what is the navigation element. And there's just so much that goes into accessibility from both the design side and the front end side. And it was really fascinating to go through this process and see the full scope of what it actually entails making something accessible.
Absolutely. And I think that's another reason, perhaps, why this particular place that designers do need that coding knowledge. Because if you are running accessibility audits or checking work, or like the piece that you did on improving website accessibility, it's good to be able to go into the code and recognize those errors. Because some of the accessibility issues are unseen because they lie within the code. And alongside website accessibility, I think that knowing a little bit more about coding and development helps you work better alongside developers too, because you can speak their language almost, and then you'll understand why certain design concepts that you might present would cause an issue for them, or how you can best design something that they can then hit the ground running with coding because you followed, let's say, standard components, or you've got a more of a template approach to your design rather than individual unique pages throughout, things like that.
I 100% agree. For me personally, having a design and front end background, that gives me a little bit of, it makes my designs almost more pragmatic because I'm already thinking about how I would develop it, even if I'm handing it off. So I'm usually trying to find the most frictionless way to get something from design to development. There's a trade-off there, but I think, like you said, having that ability to kind of conversate with the developers, understand what they're going to have to do, or understand what you're going to have to do if you take it to development, can be really helpful. And a lot of times it can even save you time as you're designing, because you can think a few steps ahead as to when this gets to development, what needs to happen.
Absolutely. And I love your point about reducing friction, because I think in the design project, there are so many other elements like input from stakeholders, feedback from user research that will add into that process, that you don't want to then add additional time between handoff of design development too.
Totally. And a lot of times, even with developers, if we're using like a calendar library, a lot of times I'll just be like, hey, just tell me what library you're using and I will match the design to that. Because there's no real benefit to creating this highly custom component that someone's going to have to custom build and code. If we can use something that's already within their wheelhouse and I can just kind of match the design and maybe theme it a little bit, but just understand like what default code they're using and coming from, and save some time on that end as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you have climbed the ranks in your field, and looking back, wondered if you had been able to identify some highs and lows of your career that you could share with us.
Yeah, definitely. So if I'm looking back and I were to pinpoint a low in my career, I guess it's probably something in like the early stages of my career. So when I graduated uni, I think perhaps for a lot of students, you get the impression that you have a degree, so you'll instantly or quite quickly fall into a job. But for myself, it took me 8 months to get my first design role. And during that time, I was working on like a Mexican restaurant, and I was still working on my portfolio and CV, doing like loads of design tests, interviews, and just getting in that cycle of almost getting to hiring stage, but then not quite, which felt like quite a bit of a knockback when you're not getting into the role that you studied for quite soon after graduating. It can make you kind of like, it made me doubt myself almost, like, am I good enough to be doing this? Like, why am I not getting these design roles and opportunities? Eventually though, it did come. And then I moved down to the Midlands and got settled in my first digital design role. But then even there, I guess, coming from university into a design job, it's not the same as studying. It was a digital agency, so it was really fast paced. There was quite a demand on time and meeting deadlines. And I did grow and learn quite a lot there. But I guess another learn might be receiving bad feedback. So I put together some concepts for the director and went in to share them. And the feedback was dreadful. It was just like, there was no softening the blow. He was like, what is this? Like, we just don't, this is not to the standard we need it. I was just like, okay. I think in that moment, I think I didn't know what to say, but I did manage to kind of rescue a bit by asking a question of like, right, I understand like this isn't what we want, but what should I be working on putting together for the next presentation? And that helped me get viable feedback. But I had to also quickly learn to detach myself from my work because some things like it's painful. Like they just were a bit brutal. Like either it works or it doesn't.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Wow. So really curious to see in kind of that low point of like you're going through these 8 months of interviewing and trying to get a job. From your perspective, what was it that got you over the hump to actually get the first job that kind of separated you from someone who had a degree to someone who had an actual job? And what's some advice that you could give someone who's gone through a boot camp and is looking for a job, or graduated from university and is looking to get their first digital job? Like, what helped get you over that hump?
I think I owed a lot of it to my portfolio and the fact that when I graduated, I did not get the job with the same portfolio that I graduated with. So with every interview I had, I iterated on it, I improved it. And I really enhanced or like talked in great detail about the work experience that I did. So in the final year of my degree, I did manage to do 2 days a week at an agency. And I used the experience that I had there because it was filling wearable tech. It was really cool. It was a really well-rounded experience because I did like a bit of marketing design, a bit of like social media design and ads. So I got a lot of variety there. And I tailored my portfolio with each application I went for. I didn't use the same generic all for all. If one company was big on mobile apps, I would tailor it to mobile apps. I would talk about the skills that relate to the job role. I think even though I didn't get a job straight away, I became better at applying and presenting myself to companies because of that lengthy delay. So advice to those who are just starting out is to really read the job description, put together a portfolio that relates to the company, really tailor it and make it specific and not just to send out generic ones to everyone.
That's really good advice. Folks that I've interviewed that are kind of newer in their career, that could be something that's super helpful, is to tailor your pitch or your resume or your portfolio to the specific job description. Because, sometimes not. I would be like, hey, it looks like you're more like this. Is that what you want to do? I don't want to hire you for this if this isn't like actually what you want to do.
Yeah.
And so having a tailored approach could certainly help get you over the hump in a lot of scenarios, I think.
Definitely. And it shows the company that you paid attention, especially if you kind of talk about what projects they do, or you kind of relate and reflect and show that you've invested the time to research them. I think it makes you stand out to them also.
Yeah. Funny story. I just had a job posting on Dribble, and you get tons of replies, and some of them are really thoughtful and to the point and talk about your job description and what you're looking for. And some of them you can just tell they're just like copy and paste. This one applicant was just like, here's all the examples of my packaging design. Here's all the examples of my logo design. Here's all the examples of my UX design. I was like, okay, well, like 66.6% of this is not at all what I'm looking for. So it's like, just tells me that you didn't really take any time to look through this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a really good nugget of truth to be able to pull out. Tailor your portfolio specifically to the job that you want to get. Looking back over your career, hindsight is always 2020. Is there anything that you would look back and give yourself advice as you start off in your career, whether it be something around like don't take feedback personally, or strategies on interpersonal relationships or working with stakeholders, anything that you would look back in your career and say like, I wish I would have known this when I started?
Definitely. I think in the case of like going through university, you're just excited to be there as like a young person, and you might not double down on it straight away. Because I did notice a trend that the mature students who did come in, they like had their eyes on the prize. They knew what they were doing, like all their assignments in early. And I think I managed to gain a bit of insight or advice because I did go on an Erasmus year. So I went to study in France for a year, did visual design. And I was messaging all my friends who were doing that third year, like, so have you got any tips, any advice coming back in to do third year myself? And those was one that I totally vouch for is gaining experience. So when I did go back for my third year, I found an internship as soon as I could. And I was working 2 days a week alongside completing my degree. But had I known the value of industry experience in tech, I would have done that from my first year or as soon as possible, because that can give you work experience. It can give you case studies and just valuable insights of what to expect from working in that role and building all those network connections and interpersonal relationships. And just, it's such a well-rounding experience. It really complements any studying that you're doing by doing internships or work placements.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good perspective, because if you think of a work project versus a school project, they're just completely different animals. With something that's a work project, it's like, oh, you've had to deal with probably a lot more people and a lot more input, versus a school project. Maybe you're just trying to submit it for peer critique or even teacher critique or something like that. But actually getting a real world project to the finish line is kind of a different beast and gives a little bit more real world experience that you would need to benefit yourself or to show yourself that you can actually do this in the real world.
Definitely. And I think it's great to just build on that experience from early on, because I think sometimes perhaps experience is just as qualifications, boot camps, degrees, if not more, depending on how much you have.
Absolutely. Yeah. And not to mention just the connections you gain, like real world connections of people at actual jobs that could refer you or bring you in. To your point, yes, anyone listening, if you can get an internship or start working at a place as early as possible in your career, in your college years, definitely do that. If you can't, do some freelance work, build a product that you enjoy or that you want to exist, or try to build something really cheaply for someone who has a good business idea, but maybe doesn't have the budget, but you might be able to work with them because you're younger in your career. I think anything like that is going to help get you ahead of the game in a large way. In addition to your day job, you also make videos on YouTube for UX designers, which is pretty cool. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your journey into content creation?
Yeah, absolutely. So this came about during lockdown last year in summer. I'd been in my new UX role for a couple of months and I wanted to get better at public speaking. And I thought, well, I've not got lots of opportunities right now. There are some, but they're all aligned in sprint cycles. And then when we have like retros and we can feedback to stakeholders, I want to be building on my public speaking confidence in the background. So I started a YouTube channel so I could document my journey in UX and then also share to other aspiring designers, junior designers, people in tech about UX design, tips about interviewing, and just kind of having those resources readily available should anyone need more than just like an Instagram conversation. Because I had a few chats with people who did want a bit of support getting into tech. And I found that being able to send them a video alongside sharing those answers was really good. And also I've just got a passion for the Adobe suite. So I really like video editing as well, because exploring different effects and just how I can piece together a story is something that I really enjoyed doing.
That's awesome. So how do you manage to find time to do this in addition to your day job and not get burnt out?
This is a very good question. If you'd asked me maybe 6 months ago, I'd be like, I do not have the time. Because when I launched my first video, I wasn't really organized and didn't have a backlog of other videos in the background. I just kind of put one up there and it was really well received. And I was like, oh no, I need to put out another one next week. But I've got all these work deadlines, just life deadlines. Where are we going to find the time? So it was a real struggle at the start and quite inconsistent with posting. But then I listened to a podcast, which was about running a side hustle in an hour a day. And I thought, this is brilliant. What? How can you possibly do that? But it just broke down that if you want to achieve something, you've got to make it manageable and fit in your day. So now what I do is spend an hour a day just touching on different parts of the YouTube channel. So one day might be scripting, another might be idea generation. One day might be thumbnails, because thumbnails take a long time. And now what I try and do is batch my content, or at least give myself the grace to say, okay, rather than every week, because I'm working full time, I'll do one every other week, and then constantly keep something in the pipeline to work on. So now it's a lot better than it was a few months ago. And I'm getting in the swing of things, which is good. And it's not only YouTube, because sometimes you've got to balance like your Instagram, your Twitter, and all these other things. But I think it's important not to get burnt out. It's something that you do hear a lot of in tech, and I'm really trying my best to avoid it, because I think it's important to look after yourself. Work is work, but
Absolutely.
you need to be okay too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you mentioned about kind of like time boxing is really a cool concept. One thing I've kind of noticed for myself is I will take up the amount of time that I give myself to do something. So if I'm like, I have all day to just do these 2 tasks, guess what? It's going to take me all day to do them. But if I'm like, okay, I have to get this thing done before 10 a.m., more often than not, that gives me the pressure I need to be able to like buckle down and just like remove obstacles, cut out what needs to be cut out, and just like do that thing within that time frame.
Definitely. I think it's really important to just set yourself a time, because like you say, you can take as long as you're given. Yeah.
Definitely. So what was that initial video that you put out that gained popularity that kind of sparked your thought of like, oh, this could actually be something?
So it was my first day in the life of a UX designer working from home. I did that in the midst of the lockdown, just to kind of show like what routines I had in place to keep myself motivated throughout the day. And I also kind of talked about the structure of the team. I just went into nice details throughout different parts of my day. And it received a lot of good feedback, because some people in my circle didn't know what a UX designer was. They didn't know what I did all day. So they really appreciated being able to get a good breakdown of more details about the structure, what we do, why we do what we do. I really enjoyed sharing that, because the style of the video was very like, here's like different segments of the day rather than my normal format of talking to the camera. So I think all of that pieced together went down really well.
That's awesome. I have been spending some time on your YouTube channel, and you have some really good videos specifically surrounding UX interview tips. Like we were talking about before, you probably got pretty good at interviewing because you had to do so many for that period. Are there any like quick tips here that you can share with us that are beneficial for UX designers interviewing to try to get their next job?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I think what I broke down in my recent video was to approach it like a project, that you're going into this interview and you want to make sure that you've done your research. You don't want to go in blind. So do a research of the company, know the work that they do, who they work with, perhaps any recent projects that they've shared in case studies that you could use as talking points. Research the job role itself. So they give you like some bullet points of your day-to-day activities. Do you have any questions about those? Do you already have experience that relates to that? Really arm yourself well with research to go to the interview. I gave some practical tips on if perhaps it's a Zoom setting, how you can set yourself up to give like the best impression through internet. And then I think also remembering that you are also interviewing the company, not just they're interviewing you, so that you want to make sure that they're the right company that you want to work with, and invest the time to think of questions that would really help answer that for you.
That's fantastic. I think your last point is really interesting about how you say you're also interviewing the company. And one trick that I've picked up from interviewing is, so, when you're in an interview, a company will typically ask, like, why do you want to work for us? And that's a really good opportunity for you to say what you know about the company or whatever. And subconsciously, it makes you think about giving a good reason or making up a good reason in your mind why this company is good or why they're desirable. And you can also do the same thing as an interviewee, where you can say something along the lines of like, why would you want to hire someone like me? Or why did you extend the offer for me to interview? And whether they know it or not, that's going to subconsciously make the company try to think of good reasons why they wanted to bring you in and bring those subconscious thoughts to reality. It's kind of one of those things of like, if you go into the job and you're really thirsty and you're super needy, that might just psychologically make the company feel like this person is a little like whatever. But if you're kind of like, I don't know, why would this be a good place for me to work? And they're like, oh, we got to show them why this will be good for them. So it's kind of along those lines of like, nothing comes to you if you chase it, but you got to, I don't know, play like a little bit hard to get or something.
Yeah, definitely. And also flipping the question around can help you dispel any nerves you might have about about the interview, that you can also ask them the questions that they'll have to give you good answers to. They'll just be like, you should work here because, yeah.
It sounds weird, but I did a lot of interviews for just random companies earlier in my career. And there's a ton of interviews that like I just didn't really have my heart set on the company. I was willing to chat with them, and kind of my attitude of just being like more so just wanting them to show me what they could offer almost made me more desirable to them. So I don't know. I feel like I did my best interviews when it was a company that I didn't actually want to work for.
Always the case.
Another thing that I've observed from your profile and some of your videos is the concept of design mentoring. I think there's a lot of talk and discussion about finding a mentor and what a mentor is and how it's so helpful to have a mentor. So I was wondering if you could kind of give us a little insight into what you think a successful version of design mentoring looks like, and how that looks day to day for someone mentoring and getting mentored.
Definitely. So I think I'll touch on this both inside and outside of the work placement. So if you are in a company and you do have a design mentor, I think that's more formal and structured in the sense that perhaps you'd have one-to-ones, like bi-weekly, where you discuss any challenges you're facing at work, what you've been working on, and how the more senior designer can support you in that. Perhaps the company will also offer you training in different areas of your role that you want to upskill in. And then also there is the performance review, which might be yearly or every 6 months. I think that's something that all companies should have in place for their junior designers, or anyone who really wants to kind of move up in terms of seniority or wants to enhance their skills in a certain area, because that is supporting your team, and a support team will grow and do well. Outside of work, it can be a little different. So there are lots of different platforms that host mentors and mentees where they can connect people together. I work or have a profile on Superpeer where I offer mentoring sessions in different capacities. So that could be just a one-to-one chat about getting into design, or a portfolio review, or even a mock interview if someone wanted to go through what an interview session might look like, to build questions that they'd ask. And there are a variety of different platforms available now. And I think it's really, perhaps I'm more aware of it because I am now a design mentor, but I know starting out, that's something I wanted and looked for, but didn't know where to find it. So it's good now that there are different platforms that answer the need of people wanting to be connected with design mentors.
Yeah, that's cool. I have recently seen Superpeer, and I haven't really done anything on the platform, but that looks like a really awesome opportunity for folks. I think there's like this weird thing of like, how do you find a mentor? And if you ask someone to be a mentor, do they just do that out of like the goodness of their heart? But I think there's a pretty good model on there where it's like, maybe you get a free session, but you're paying for someone to legitimately invest in you and give you honest and good feedback and ideas and mentoring and a learning path or a career path. It sounds like a pretty good method if you're looking for someone to kind of get connected with.
Definitely. And it can be on more of a short-term or long-term basis, but I still answer questions come up on my YouTube channel in the comments or in DMs. I try my best to support people as much as I can in those areas, but sometimes if there are longer questions or they want you to take a look at something, then I direct people through a more formal platform like Superpeer to like book in the time. Then we can like deep dive on it together.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really cool. That I can see that being a really good, I don't want to say sales funnel, but just like lead in to a service that you offer, where it's like if you're on the YouTube channel or if you're on social, you might get a little bit of insight and a little bit of wisdom. But if you really want to go deep and get a deeper understanding of the concept or the topic, there's an avenue for that.
Yeah. So hopefully that offers something for everyone, that like the free knowledge that's shared through YouTube is accessible at any time. But then if you do want the focus time, you've got to get in.
Absolutely. One of my last questions, curious, you being in the UK, if you have noticed if you've had the opportunity to work with folks either in the States or other countries, or just on identifying differences between UX designers across different places of the world, if there's idiosyncrasies that US designers have, or things that you guys do different in the UK, or things that you've picked up on working with different folks in different areas that might be interesting to talk through.
Definitely. In my previous UX role, we did have more of a worldwide team. We had someone in Brazil, someone in Nigeria, maybe a few people in the wider Europe space. Time zones were interesting to sync up for the stand-up call in the morning. But in terms of design processes, I think we all worked in a fairly similar way. Because I think most designs are quite unique in the way like they name their layers or how they structure their files. So I didn't see any differences there. But something that I've noticed globally is there seems to be like a naming convention shift, of where I've noticed some UX designers are now becoming product designers. And I don't know if that's like a trend or their role has changed. I don't know what's happened, but I've started seeing that shift, and I'm just wondering like, what's going on? I don't have an answer to it, but I've noticed it.
Yeah, totally. What I noticed is there used to be this idea of web designer, and then that transformed into UI designer, and then that transformed into UX designer. And then it was like really heavy on mobile. And it was like, I'm a mobile UX designer or whatever. Now it's transitioning to what seems to be product designer. And I think it's just part of the trend of every few years, the industry kind of reinvents itself or positions and things like that. So I think it's just the continuation of further refining what we actually do.
This is true. And I mean, I'm saying that having not known UX design a few years ago. So perhaps it's going through those cycles and changes, adapting the names, the role changes.
One interesting thing that I have interacted with a designer in the UK is, and you'll have to tell me if this is true for you, but as I was looking to potentially bring someone on a contractual basis who lived in the UK, he seemed to not have really the concept of like an hourly rate, but more so a day rate. In the US, it's all kind of just based on hours. And he's like, when I have a client, I just like work for them for the day. And I was like, that's so interesting. And he's like, that's just how you guys do it.
It is. I can confirm, because like at our company, when we are hiring contractors, we always say, so what is your day rate? Or we'll tell them what our company day rate is. I didn't know that hourly was, well, let's move.
Yeah. Yeah. Super interesting. I don't know why the more granularity, but like everything's totally based off in hours, not days here.
We like a round number, whatever that number may be. So we always just say, so a day. Yeah.
Yes. Awesome. Well, Jadene, thank you so much for coming on. I think you have a really cool learning path. You have shared so much with us, but for folks who want to learn more, there's obviously a treasure trove of learning and information that you guys can find on Jadene's YouTube channel. Also, if you want to go even deeper with Jadene, you can schedule a mentoring session where you can get more of her insight and wisdom there. Jadene, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
Thanks so much for hanging out with us today on the Product Design Podcast. If you enjoyed our conversation, be sure and go follow our guest. Let them know they did a great job and you learned a lot. More to come in the following weeks as we bring on new guests. Please hit that subscribe button so that you will get these podcasts and learn a ton about the product design community. Excited to see you next time. Thanks.